My son looked me dead in the eye and said, "I wish I could choose a different mother." I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I just smiled, handed back his lawyer's envelope, and walked away, taking everything he was counting on with me. The roast chicken sat untouched between us, going cold under the kitchen lights, and my son looked me dead in the eye and said, "I wish I could choose my own mother." The clock on the shelf kept ticking. Fog pressed against the windows the way it does most October nights in this part of Connecticut. Nobody moved, nobody reached for the gravy boat, or the wine, or each other's hands the way we used to on Sunday dinners 20 years ago, back when this table meant something other than a battlefield with placemats. Brandon was 32 years old, not a child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. A grown man in a $300 cashmere sweater, sitting in the house his father left me, waiting, patiently, the way you wait for a vending machine to finish dispensing something you already paid for me to hand it over. Jessica smiled beside him. A small, satisfied smile, the kind of smile a woman wears when she's watching a plan click neatly into place, tab into slot. I folded my napkin, twice. It's a habit Richard used to tease me about. You fold that napkin like it owes you money, Linda. And I did it that night because my hands needed something to do besides shake. An envelope sat by Brandon's elbow, cream-colored, heavy stock, a lawyer's return address embossed in the corner in navy ink. He'd called it simplifying the estate twice already that evening, the phrase rehearsed, smooth, the kind of language that gets workshopped in a conference room before it ever makes it to a dinner table. He meant transferring my house to him. This was Richard's house, my husband's house, the one he'd built with me, one careful year and one paid-off mortgage installment at a time, the one he'd left to me, not to the trust, not to Brandon, to me, in writing, notarized 3 years before the cancer took him. And now our son was sitting across from me with a lawyer's envelope and a smile from a woman I'd never once fully trusted, asking me to sign it away like it was a formality he'd simply forgotten to mention. I need to explain who I was before that dinner, because the woman who folded her napkin twice that night was not the woman I'd been for most of my life, and understanding the difference is the whole point of what happened next. My name is Linda Whitfield. I'm 61 years old. I sit on the board of 2 nonprofits, a literacy foundation and a hospice organization Richard and I supported for 15 years, and I have, since Richard's death 4 years ago, personally managed the Whitfield Family Trust down to the decimal point, a responsibility his estate attorney once told me most surviving spouses hand off entirely, out of grief or exhaustion, or both. I didn't hand it off. I learned it. I sat through every quarterly statement, every actuarial table, every conversation with our financial advisor, because Richard trusted me with it, and because some stubborn part of me needed to prove, to Brandon, to myself, to no one in particular, that competence doesn't require a law degree or an MBA, just attention and the willingness to ask a question twice if the first answer doesn't quite land. Brandon had never worked that way. He'd always been brilliant in the specific, dazzling way that skips certain fundamentals. A Stanford dropout at 20 who'd started 3 companies by 32, 2 of which failed spectacularly and expensively, one of which was, at the time of that dinner, pre-revenue, a phrase I'd learned to hear as a soft, well-dressed word for not yet real. For 38 years, Richard had watched me rescue this boy from every hard lesson life tried to teach him. The overdrawn accounts in college, the co-signed lease in his 20s, the bridge loan at 28 that never got bridged or repaid. Near the end, lying in a hospital bed that had taken over what used to be his study, Richard called it what it actually was: interference. "You keep catching him, Linny," he told me 3 weeks before he died, his voice thin but his eyes clear as they'd ever been. "One day you won't be able to, and it'll hurt him worse for having never learned to catch himself." I told him he was wrong. I believed right up until that October dinner 4 years later that love meant showing up every single time. No exceptions, no lessons learned the hard way if I could help it. I told myself the strange comments Brandon made about when the house transfers to me eventually, over the years, were just careless talk, the kind of thing grown children say without thinking, the way you'd mention inheriting your mother's china. I told myself Jessica's questions about how the trust was structured, asked so casually over brunch 18 months into their relationship, were simple curiosity, nothing more. I was wrong about almost all of it, but I didn't fully understand how wrong until that envelope showed up on my dinner table, cream-colored and heavy, sitting there like it had already won. 6 months before that dinner, Brandon called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice bright in the particular way it got whenever he was about to ask for something large. "Mom, I need to run something by you. The San Jose deal. It's real this time. I've got 2 investors circling, but they want to see I have skin in the game. Real collateral, not just projections." I asked carefully what he meant by collateral. "Nothing crazy, just theoretically, if the house was in my name, or if I could show a lender I had access to it, it changes the entire conversation. It's not about using it, it's about optics." I told myself it was nothing unusual. Business people talk about collateral and optics the way the rest of us talk about weather, a language, not necessarily a plan. I reminded him, gently, that he already received a quarterly distribution from his father's trust, generous enough that he'd started adult life completely debt-free, an advantage most of his peers would have killed for. "That's not the same thing, Mom. That's an allowance. This is different." I let it go that day. I told myself he was young. 31 isn't that young. Some honest part of me argued back, but I overruled it. And ambitious. And ambition sometimes talks a little wild before it settles down. I didn't yet understand that the conversation wasn't a stray comment, it was a pitch, and I was the investor he was warming up. 2 months later, at a brunch I'd hosted for Brandon's 32nd birthday, Jessica asked me, between bites of Eggs Benedict, how the Whitfield family trust was structured. Specifically, she wondered whether the house fell under the trust's umbrella or existed as a separate personal asset. It was such a specific question, phrased with such particular legal precision, that it stopped me mid-sip of coffee. "Why do you ask?" I said, as lightly as I could manage. "No reason," she said, smiling. "I just think it's smart, as a family, to have clarity on these things. Estate planning gets messy when nobody talks about it early." I told myself it was nothing. Jessica worked in commercial real estate. Asking precise questions about asset structure was simply how her brain was wired, the same way mine was wired to fold napkins twice. I didn't yet know, wouldn't know for another 4 months, that she'd been quietly researching California's homestead exemption laws, or that she'd mentioned to a mutual friend, at a dinner party I wasn't invited to, that Brandon's mother was sitting on an asset that could genuinely change their trajectory. My stomach dropped a little that day at brunch, in a way I couldn't fully name yet. I changed the subject to the weather. I have replayed that moment more times than I'd like to admit. What I didn't know until much later, Patricia's private investigator turned it up during discovery, months after that October dinner, was that Jessica had already scheduled a preliminary consultation with a real estate attorney in San Jose that same week, asking hypothetical questions about transferring out-of-state property into a business entity for investment purposes. Hypothetical, the attorney's own intake notes read, though the property address she provided matched mine down to the zip code, she'd been building her own file on my house for months before I ever suspected there was a file to build. The clearest warning came 6 weeks before the dinner, and I nearly caught it in time. Brandon texted me a photo, a rendering of a glass-fronted office building, the kind of image architecture firms produce to make an idea feel inevitable before a single permit is filed. "This could be real, Mom. San Jose. I just need the last piece to fall into place." I called him that night and asked directly, no softening, whether the last piece meant my house. He didn't deny it. "It wouldn't be forever," he said. "Once the raise closes, we transfer it right back. Or I buy you something even better, somewhere warmer. Arizona, maybe. You've talked about Arizona." I told him no, clearly. The first real no I'd given him in longer than I could remember. He went quiet on the phone in a way that unsettled me more than shouting would have. A controlled, calculating quiet, the sound of someone recalculating a strategy rather than accepting an answer. I hung up and sat in Richard's old study for an hour, hands cold, replaying every rescue I'd ever staged for this boy, wondering, for the first time in 32 years, whether I'd built a son or built a habit he'd never had to outgrow. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name was Patricia Vance, JD, the estate and elder law specialist who'd handled Richard's will and had, over 4 years, become something between a professional advisor and a friend. I told her about the trust question at brunch, the San Jose rendering, the word collateral used like a crowbar. I asked her plainly what my actual legal exposure was if Brandon or Jessica tried anything without my consent. "None as it stands," Patricia told me. "The house is titled solely in your name, separate from the trust, exactly the way Richard structured it. Nobody can transfer it without your signature." "But Linda," she paused, and I remember the particular care in her voice. "People don't usually ask this many pointed questions about a house they have no plan for. I'd suggest we document this conversation, just in case." I said yes. It felt, at the time, faintly paranoid, faintly disloyal to my own son. It would turn out to be the single most important phone call I made all year. That night, alone in the kitchen after the call, I sat with a cup of tea I didn't drink and tried to remember the last time Brandon had asked me a question about my life that wasn't, in some indirect way, connected to the house, the trust, or what I might eventually leave behind. I couldn't come up with one from the past 2 years. That, more than anything Jessica had said at brunch, was the detail that kept me up until nearly 1 in the morning, staring at a ceiling that suddenly felt larger and quieter than it had the night before. In the weeks that followed, I did something I'd never done in 32 years of motherhood. I started building a file on my own child, the same way I'd once built spreadsheets tracking his college overdrafts, except this time the stakes were the roof over my head. Patricia Vance helped me draft a formal memorandum, confirming sole ownership of the house, dated and notarized, with a clause explicitly stating that any future transfer required independent legal counsel, representing my interests exclusively. A safeguard, she explained, against exactly the kind of pressured, informal family conversation I now suspected was coming. I also met, at Patricia's recommendation, with Dr. Elena Marsh, a licensed family therapist with a specialty in adult-child financial dynamics, 22 years in practice. I went in expecting a lecture about boundaries. I got something more useful, a clear clinical name for what I'd been living inside for over a decade. "What you're describing," Dr. Marsh told me in our second session, "isn't generosity anymore. It's a pattern called financial enmeshment, where a parent's identity becomes so tied to rescuing a child that the child never develops the tolerance for disappointment that adulthood requires. It's not too late to change it. It will feel at first like you're the one doing something wrong. You aren't." I also, quietly, had a conversation with our longtime family financial advisor, Marcus Dayton, CFP, who'd managed the Whitfield accounts alongside Richard for nearly 20 years. I asked him to run a conservative projection. What would happen to Brandon's trust distributions if the San Jose deal collapsed, the way his previous previous two ventures had. Marcus's answer was blunt in the way only a man who'd known you 2 decades could afford to be. He'd survive it, Linda, comfortably even. What he wouldn't survive is thinking he can't. By the night of that October dinner, I had a notarized ownership memorandum, a documented paper trail of the collateral conversations, a therapist's professional framing of what was actually happening in my family, and a financial advisor's honest projection of what my son could actually withstand. I hadn't built any of it to hurt Brandon. I'd built it because some tired, clear-eyed part of me finally understood that love without a spine isn't protection. It's just a longer, slower kind of losing someone. The dinner itself, when it came, felt less like a conversation and more like a closing meeting I hadn't agreed to attend. Mom, Brandon said, leaning forward, elbows on the table, in the exact posture I'd watched him use in a video pitch deck he'd once sent me by accident. You're acting like I'm trying to take something from you. I looked at the cream envelope sitting by his elbow. Aren't you? Jessica leaned back, diamonds catching the dining room light. Nobody's taking anything, Linda. This house is an underused asset. Underused. I thought of Richard reading the newspaper in that study every Sunday morning for 31 years, coffee going cold beside him because he always got absorbed in the crossword. I thought of Brandon at 8 years old, asleep under a blanket fort built out of every couch cushion in this house, snoring the specific way he still snores now, 32 years old and unaware I know that detail about him. It is my home, I said. It could be the foundation for something bigger, Brandon snapped. The San Jose deal. If I show investors I have real collateral, everything changes. You already get a distribution from your father's trust. That's not enough for this. It was enough to start you debt-free at 22. He leaned in further. You don't understand how business works anymore, Mom. This is a different world than Dad's. I understand a signature is forever, I said, my hands finding the napkin again. Folding it a third time, though I'd promised myself twice was the limit. And a lease is 60 days. His jaw tightened. And then he played the card I'd been bracing for since Patricia's phone call weeks earlier. Dad would have understood. There it was. Not a request anymore. A weapon, aimed precisely, the way only someone who'd watched you grieve for 4 years would know exactly where to aim it. He would have wanted you to stand on your own, I said. And I meant it, because I finally, fully believed the thing Richard had told me from that hospital bed. That was never interference, Brandon. That was him trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. That's easy for you to say, Brandon shot back. You're sitting on everything he built. Jessica's phone lit up on the table beside her plate, a message flashing bright enough that I caught it before she could turn the screen face down. Did she sign yet? I saw it. She saw me see it, and something in her expression flickered. Not shame, exactly. Recalculation. The same cold, quick recalculation I'd heard in Brandon's voice on the phone 6 weeks earlier. This dinner was never a conversation. It was a closing. They had walked into my home that night expecting my signature the way you'd expect a formality, a box to check on the way to something they'd already decided was theirs. You've always been controlling, Brandon said, his voice rising for the first time all night. Jessica's family actually supports ambition. They don't sit on property like it's a shrine. Jessica rested a manicured hand on his forearm, her voice gone soft and reasonable, the tone I imagined she used in closing meetings of her own. We just think it's time the assets were managed by someone focused on the future. I almost laughed out loud, right there at my own dinner table. I sat on 2 nonprofit boards. I managed a multi-million-dollar family trust, down to the decimal point, had done so unassisted for 4 years, with a financial advisor who'd tell you himself I asked sharper questions than most of his institutional clients. But because I didn't dress my choices up in words like scale and disruption and optics, they had mistaken responsibility for fear, competence for sentiment, love for weakness. I stood. I collected the plates, his, hers, mine, the chicken still nearly whole in its serving dish, and carried them into the kitchen without a word, because I needed 60 seconds alone with the sink before I could trust my own voice. My hands shook, just slightly, running water over plates nobody had eaten from, not enough for them to see. I thought about Dr. Marsh's voice from our last session. It will feel, at first, like you're the one doing something wrong. You aren't. I dried my hands on the dish towel Richard's mother had given us at our wedding 39 years ago, and I walked back into the dining room steadier than I'd left it. Brandon was already standing when I came back, coat over his arm, wearing the specific wounded expression he'd perfected over 3 decades, the one designed to make me feel guilty for the crime of disappointing him. We'll give you a few days, he said, magnanimous, like he was extending a courtesy. No, he blinked, genuinely thrown, like I'd answered a question he hadn't actually asked. No, I will not sign over the house. Not tonight, not next week, not ever. I reached into the drawer of the sideboard, where I'd placed it that afternoon after my last call with Patricia, and set the notarized ownership memorandum on the table beside his untouched envelope. This confirms sole title, dated and filed with the county recorder's office this Monday. My attorney, Patricia Vance, has advised that any future conversation about this property go through her office, with independent counsel representing me, not the family lawyer you two hired to draft that transfer request. Jessica's smile disappeared entirely. Brandon gave a short, bitter laugh, the sound of a closing that had just fallen through. So that's it? You're choosing a house over your own son? I am choosing myself, I said, for the first time since your father died. He scoffed. Very dramatic, Mom. Call it whatever helps you sleep tonight. I looked around the dining room Richard and I had built one careful year at a time. The old piano in the corner, still slightly out of tune, because he'd always loved loved its flawed, honest sound more than a perfectly tuned one. I thought of Dr. Marsh's phrase, financial enmeshment, and I thought of how strange it was that a clinical term could feel, in that moment, like the truest sentence anyone had said about my life in years. "No," I said. "I'm choosing to stop confusing love with surrender." Brandon stared at me like I'd spoken in a language he'd never learned. Jessica stood first, smoothing the front of her dress with both hands. "Come on," she said quietly. "She's made herself clear." Brandon lingered a second longer at the table, waiting, I think, for the fold. The specific, practiced fold I'd performed for him 100 times before, the one where I'd sigh and say, "Let's talk about this tomorrow when we're calmer," which had always meant, eventually, "Let's talk about this until I give you what you want." I didn't move. I didn't fold the napkin a fourth time. I just stood there in my own kitchen, in the house my husband left to me and only me, and let the silence do what 32 years of rescuing had never once accomplished. Let my son understand, fully and without a safety net, that the answer was final. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass panel beside it, and for the first time in 32 years, I let my son walk away without chasing after him down the driveway, without a phone call an hour later, smoothing things over, without a single concession dressed up as compromise. 3 months passed before Brandon called again. I didn't reach out first, which was, Dr. Marsh told me in our next session, possibly the hardest and most important boundary I'd held in my adult life. The San Jose deal collapsed in December. Marcus Dayton's projection turned out to be almost exactly right, down to the dollar figure Brandon's remaining trust distributions could absorb without real hardship. Jessica, I later learned through a mutual family friend, had already begun distancing herself by the time the investors formally pulled out. Whatever she'd been managing toward, it apparently required a signature that was never going to come. Brandon and I are speaking again now, carefully, the way two people rebuild a bridge they both remember burning. He hasn't asked about the house since. I don't think he will again. Not because he's forgiven me for saying no, exactly, but because some part of him, I believe, finally understood what Patricia's memorandum and Dr. Marsh's sessions had really been protecting. Not a property deed, but the last honest version of myself I had left to give him. I still fold my napkin twice at dinner, most nights, out of habit more than nerves now. The piano is still out of tune. I still sit on those same two boards, still manage the truss down to the decimal point, still sleep, most nights, in the room where Richard told me, 3 weeks before he died, that one day I wouldn't be able to catch our son, and that it would hurt him worse for never having learned to catch himself. He was right about almost everything, my husband. It only took me 4 years, one cream-colored envelope, one notarized memorandum, and a roast chicken gone cold on the table to finally believe him. I didn't raise my voice that night. I didn't need to. I just stood in my own kitchen, in my own home, and smiled through the silence, the first thing in 32 years that had ever truly, finally been mine to